Margaret's husband survived his stroke, and doctors called it a miracle recovery. His speech returned. He could walk again, and everyone celebrated how lucky he was. But 6 months later, Margaret discovered something terrifying that no one had warned her about. Her husband, who had run a successful business for 30 years, couldn't understand why their credit cards were being declined. He'd been paying the same bill 5 times while leaving others completely unpaid. The man who once managed complex financial decisions was now financially destroying their family, and he had no idea anything was wrong. This is the hidden truth about vascular dementia recovery that medical teams rarely discuss. Today I'm revealing what happens to the brain after stroke that goes far beyond the physical recovery everyone focuses on. If someone in your life has had strokes and you're noticing changes that don't make sense, this could save your family from financial and emotional disaster. What Margaret discovered is that stroke recovery has 2 completely different timelines that medical teams treat separately. Physical recovery gets all the attention: speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy focused on movement and daily tasks. But cognitive recovery? That's often ignored entirely until it becomes a crisis. Here's what's happening in the brain that no one explained to Margaret. Every stroke, no matter how minor, kills brain cells permanently. While the brain can sometimes reroute functions around damaged areas, those specific cognitive abilities tied to the destroyed tissue are gone forever. Margaret's husband's stroke affected his frontal lobe, the brain's CEO region that handles financial planning, decision-making, and impulse control. His speech center wasn't damaged, so he could talk normally. His motor cortex was fine, so he could move normally. But his ability to understand consequences and manage complex decisions was permanently compromised. The cruel irony is that this type of damage often goes undetected for months because the person seems fine in casual conversation. Margaret's husband could discuss current events, remember family stories, and appear completely normal to neighbors and friends. It was only when complex cognitive demands arose, like managing finances or making important decisions, that the damage became apparent. Medical teams focus on what's visible and measurable. Can you walk? Can you speak? Can you feed yourself? But the subtle cognitive changes that affect judgment, planning, and decision-making require different testing that often doesn't happen until families demand it. Margaret spent 8 months thinking she was going crazy, watching her competent husband make increasingly poor decisions, while everyone told her how well he was recovering from his stroke. What Margaret experienced represents a pattern that financial experts are beginning to recognize, but families rarely see coming. Stroke survivors with frontal lobe damage often retain their desire to maintain independence while losing the cognitive ability to manage complex tasks safely. Margaret's husband insisted on handling the bills because he'd always done it. His pride and identity were tied to being the family's financial manager. But his damaged brain could no longer sequence complex tasks, understand abstract concepts like interest rates, or recognize when he was being taken advantage of by scammers. The warning signs seemed minor at first. Bills paid late, not because he forgot, but because he couldn't figure out the online payment process he'd used for years. Phone calls from credit card companies that he'd hang up on because the conversation felt too overwhelming to follow. Mail piling up because sorting through important versus junk mail had become cognitively exhausting. Then came the devastating decisions. Margaret discovered he'd responded to 3 separate investment opportunities that were obvious scams, draining their retirement savings. He'd signed up for multiple insurance policies, thinking each sales call was for their existing coverage. He'd agreed to home improvement contracts worth thousands of dollars for work they didn't need. The most heartbreaking part was his genuine confusion when Margaret tried to explain what had happened. His brain could no longer process abstract concepts like being taken advantage of or understand how his decisions had consequences. To him, he was just trying to handle normal business like he always had. This pattern affects thousands of stroke survivors, but families are unprepared because no one explains that financial capacity can be destroyed while other abilities remain intact. Margaret wishes someone had warned her that her husband's judgment was now compromised, even though he seemed normal in every other way. Beyond finances, Margaret discovered another hidden danger that nearly cost her husband his life. His stroke medications were complex: blood thinners that required precise timing, blood pressure medications with specific food restrictions, and diabetes medications that needed coordination with meals. Before his stroke, her husband managed his medications perfectly. After his stroke, he retained the memory that he needed to take pills, but lost the executive function to manage the complexity. Margaret found bottles with double doses taken on some days and missed doses on others. The medication confusion wasn't random, it followed a specific pattern that revealed how frontal lobe damage affects daily tasks. He could remember to take his heart medication, but couldn't process that the same medication required different timing with food. He understood he needed to check his blood sugar, but couldn't sequence the steps of testing, recording, and adjusting insulin accordingly. Margaret's husband would become frustrated and angry when she tried to help with medications, insisting he was fine and could handle it himself. His brain couldn't recognize its own limitations, a condition called anosognosia that commonly occurs after frontal lobe strokes. The breakthrough came when Margaret implemented a system that worked with his remaining abilities rather than fighting against his deficits. Instead of expecting him to manage complex timing and interactions, she created simple visual systems that required minimal decision-making. If you're finding this information helpful and recognizing patterns in your own family's experience, please hit that subscribe button. Understanding these hidden aspects of stroke recovery can prevent the medical crises that Margaret's family experienced. The key insight Margaret learned was that medication management after stroke isn't just about memory, it's about executive function, and that requires completely different strategies than the ones that worked before the stroke occurred. 6 months after his stroke, Margaret's husband passed his driving test renewal and felt vindicated that everyone was overreacting to his recovery. But Margaret noticed troubling patterns that the standard driving test had missed completely. He could still operate the vehicle mechanically. Steering, braking, and accelerating were automatic skills that his stroke hadn't affected, but his decision-making behind the wheel had become dangerously impaired. Margaret discovered he'd been getting lost in their own neighborhood, not because he forgot where he lived, but because he couldn't process complex navigation decisions. The damaged frontal lobe that affected his financial judgment was also compromising his driving safety in subtle but dangerous ways. He'd sit at four-way stops for excessive periods, unable to process who had the right of way. He'd miss highway exits because he couldn't sequence the complex decisions of reading signs, changing lanes, and timing his exit appropriately. Most alarming were his reactions to unexpected situations. When another driver cut him off, instead of defensive driving, he'd become confused and freeze, creating dangerous situations for everyone around him. His brain could no longer rapidly process and respond to the split-second decisions that safe driving requires. Margaret learned that standard driving tests evaluate motor skills and basic rules knowledge, but don't assess executive function or complex decision-making abilities. Her husband could demonstrate parallel parking in a controlled environment, but couldn't safely navigate real-world driving challenges that required rapid cognitive processing. The solution wasn't immediate license revocation, but rather specialized driving evaluation by occupational therapists trained in cognitive assessment. This testing revealed specific limitations and led to strategies that allowed limited, safe driving in familiar areas while restricting highway and complex navigation situations. Margaret's biggest frustration was how medical teams handled her concerns about her husband's cognitive changes. When she mentioned financial problems and poor judgment, she was told these were normal stress responses to having a stroke. When she reported medication errors, the response was, just set up a pill organizer. The problem wasn't that doctors didn't care, it's that stroke treatment typically focuses on acute medical management and physical rehabilitation. Cognitive rehabilitation, especially for subtle executive function deficits, often falls through the cracks between neurology, rehabilitation medicine, and primary care. Margaret learned to ask specific questions that got better responses. Instead of saying, he's making poor decisions, she'd say, I need cognitive testing to assess his executive function and capacity for financial decision-making. Instead of, he seems confused sometimes, she'd request, neuropsychological evaluation to establish cognitive baselines and identify specific deficits. The breakthrough came when Margaret found a neuropsychologist who specialized in post-stroke cognitive changes. This comprehensive evaluation revealed that while her husband's memory and language were intact, his planning, abstract thinking, and judgment were significantly impaired, findings that explained everything Margaret had been observing. Armed with this detailed cognitive assessment, Margaret could finally get appropriate support services. Occupational therapy focused on cognitive strategies, not just physical tasks. Social workers helped establish financial safeguards. The medical team began treating cognitive recovery as seriously as physical recovery. Margaret's advice to other families: demand cognitive evaluation after any stroke, regardless of how mild it appears. Don't accept he seems fine when you're observing concerning changes. Trust your observations and advocate persistently for comprehensive assessment. 3 years later, Margaret's husband has adapted remarkably well to his post-stroke cognitive changes, but only because Margaret learned to work with his brain's new limitations rather than expecting him to return to pre-stroke functioning. The key was accepting that certain abilities were permanently changed and focusing on strategies that supported his remaining strengths. For finances, Margaret took over all complex decisions while creating simple systems that allowed her husband to maintain involvement and dignity. He could still write checks for predetermined amounts, but Margaret handled all planning and decision-making. For medications, they implemented visual systems with clear daily organization and automatic refill services. Her husband maintained the routine of taking his medications, but the complex timing and coordination became automated through systems that didn't require executive function. For driving, they worked with an occupational therapist to identify safe parameters. Her husband could drive familiar routes during daylight hours, but avoided highway driving and unfamiliar destinations. Technology like GPS with voice commands helped support his remaining navigation abilities. The emotional adjustment was as important as the practical adaptations. Margaret's husband grieved the loss of his independence and competence, while Margaret grieved the loss of her partner's decision-making support. Family counseling helped them navigate these changes and find new ways to maintain their relationship dynamic. Margaret emphasizes that recovery isn't about returning to pre-stroke functioning. It's about finding new ways to live safely and meaningfully with changed abilities. The sooner families accept this reality, the sooner effective adaptations can begin. Margaret's story reveals the hidden truth about vascular dementia recovery that medical teams rarely discuss comprehensively. Stroke survivors and their families need to understand that cognitive recovery requires as much attention and specialized care as physical recovery. If you're dealing with post-stroke cognitive changes in your family, you're not imagining problems that everyone else is missing. Trust your observations and demand appropriate evaluation and support. The strategies that work require understanding exactly which cognitive abilities are affected and which remain intact. In the description below, you'll find links to my comprehensive dementia caregiving book and free resources, including post-stroke safety checklists and cognitive assessment guides. These tools provide the specific questions and strategies that Margaret wishes she'd had from the beginning. Remember, post-stroke cognitive changes are treatable and manageable with proper understanding and support. You have more control over the outcome than you might think. For your next video, I recommend watching our discussion on sleep disturbances in dementia, which often become problematic after strokes and significantly impact recovery. You might also find value in our video covering wandering behaviors in dementia patients, as spatial disorientation frequently occurs after vascular brain damage. Remember, your loved one's reality may be different from yours, but their emotions and need for comfort are absolutely real.